The debate has raged across the internet for years. Modern United States infantry versus a veteran Roman legion. Pop culture paints this as an instant, effortless slaughter, where modern technology violently vaporizes the ancient world. But when we strip away the cinematic myths and aggressively inject the brutal realities of actual combat logistics, a terrifying, highly realistic outcome begins to violently emerge from the blood-soaked dirt. This is not simply a mathematical equation of supersonic bullets versus heavy wooden shields. It is a horrific clash of finite, modern supply lines violently colliding with the absolute mass of ancient human endurance. What realistically happens when a modern platoon realizes their magazines are entirely empty and 50,000 Romans are still marching? If you demand hyper-realistic military breakdowns, aggressively hit subscribe to Clash of Eras warfare before the slaughter begins. The battlefield is a sprawling, deeply uneven European valley bordered by dense ancient forests. The terrain is rugged and completely broken, aggressively negating the massive range advantage of modern optics. Positioned on a rocky elevation is a standard United States Army infantry platoon consisting of 40 soldiers. They are highly trained, equipped with advanced Kevlar, digital optics, and deadly squad automatic weapons. But they are completely cut off from any resupply, air support, or mechanized extraction. Each rifleman carries a standard combat load of exactly 210 rounds of 5.56 ammunition. It sounds like a massive amount of firepower until you aggressively calculate the terrifying math of sustained combat. Advancing slowly through the valley below is a full, battle-hardened Roman legion of 5,000 men. They are moving in absolute, terrifying silence, their heavy red shields locked in perfect, disciplined formations. This is not a chaotic mob. It is the most lethal, highly engineered military machine of the ancient world. The modern platoon leader stares through his digital optics, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. He is calculating the brutal reality. His 40 men must kill 125 Romans each just to survive. The distance aggressively shrinks to 500 yards, entering the maximum effective range of the M4 carbines. The platoon leader violently screams the order to open fire, shattering the ancient silence. The rocky hill aggressively erupts into a deafening, continuous roar of mechanical thunder. Thousands of supersonic 5.56 projectiles tear down the valley at 3,000 feet per second. The kinetic impact on the Roman vanguard is absolute, unadulterated devastation. Heavy wooden scutum shields are violently pulverized, offering zero resistance to the modern armor-piercing cores. Ancient iron breastplates brutally buckle and shatter, driving lethal shrapnel deep into human flesh.
The first three ranks of the Roman formation are violently erased from existence in a matter of seconds. A thick, suffocating mist of hot red blood violently mixes with the dust of the valley floor. The US machine gunners aggressively sweep their M249s back and forth, cutting down men like dry grass. In any normal historical context, an army taking this level of instantaneous trauma would violently break and run. But the Roman legion was aggressively conditioned to endure horrific, unimaginable suffering without flinching. Veteran centurions violently blow their brass whistles, brutally beating their own men to hold the line. They instantly realize that the invisible thunder only travels in a straight, terrifyingly lethal line. Harsh, guttural orders violently echo through the dying ranks, triggering an immediate tactical adaptation. The massive ancient army aggressively splits apart, abandoning their tight, suicidal block formations. They violently scatter into the broken terrain and dense tree lines, drastically reducing the modern hit ratio. Up on the rocky hill, the terrifying reality of modern automatic weapons begins to aggressively manifest. Sustained suppressive fire violently generates an immense, unmanageable amount of heat and thick white smoke. A dense cloud of burning cordite violently obscures the modern firing line, severely blinding their advanced optics. The American soldiers are now firing aggressively into a thick, grey fog, completely wasting precious ammunition. Squad leaders violently scream for strict fire discipline, but the deafening roar of combat drowns them out. Empty brass casings aggressively pile up in the dirt, mathematically ticking down the platoon's lifespan. The Romans aggressively used the massive cloud of gun smoke to mask their rapid, scattered advance. They are violently closing the gap, sprinting from rock to rock with terrifying, predatory patience. Suddenly, a modern M249 machine gun violently seizes up, its barrel glowing a dangerous, bright orange. The extreme heat has aggressively warped the metal, instantly neutralizing one of the platoon's heaviest weapons. The terrified gunner frantically rips at the hot receiver, burning his hands in pure, desperate survival. That single mechanical failure violently creates a massive, vulnerable hole in the interlocking wall of lead. The surviving Roman flankers aggressively hear the thunder weaken and violently surge forward. They have successfully absorbed the apocalyptic kinetic strike and are now entering the deadly throwing range. Thousands of heavy, iron-tipped Pila javelins are aggressively raised into the smoky sky. The modern soldiers suddenly hear a terrifying, collective grunt echoing violently from the fog below. The overwhelming technological supremacy of the United States military is about to be violently tested by gravity, and the brutal, unforgiving execution of the modern infantryman is officially underway.
The sky above the rocky elevation instantly darkens as 2,000 heavy iron javelins arc downward. The modern platoon leader screams the desperate order to take hard cover behind the rocks, but modern Kevlar helmets and ceramic plates were engineered to catch high-velocity bullets. They were absolutely not designed to deflect a 3-pound iron spike falling at terminal velocity. A heavy Roman pilum brutally punches straight through a modern rifleman's exposed shoulder. He violently collapses, screaming in pure, agonizing pain as the ancient iron pins him to the dirt. Another javelin aggressively shatters the platoon medic's thigh, instantly neutralizing their only medical support. The flawless, interlocking wall of modern suppressive fire is violently and completely shattered. U.S. soldiers are forced to duck behind cover, firing blindly over the rocks and completely destroying their hit ratio. This desperate tactic violently accelerates their catastrophic ammunition consumption. Desperate, terrifying screams of "Winchester" begin to aggressively echo down the modern firing line. It is the brutal tactical code word for a soldier running entirely out of bullets. The modern platoon is rapidly hitting the fatal mathematical limits of their advanced technology. The Roman commanders physically hear the deafening mechanical thunder aggressively sputter and die. A veteran centurion blows a sharp 3-note blast on his brass whistle, signaling the final execution. The legion violently abandons their cover, drawing thousands of heavy steel gladii in perfect unison. The metallic scrape of ancient swords being drawn completely overpowers the dying echoes of the modern rifles. They aggressively charge up the rocky slope, their blood-soaked faces completely devoid of fear. The deadly distance violently collapses from 50 yards to 20 to absolute zero. The overwhelming technological gap has just violently crashed into a primitive, bloody nightmare. A modern assault rifle without ammunition is simply a poorly balanced 6-pound club, and a modern soldier is not psychologically conditioned to survive a close-quarters meat grinder against shielded heavy infantry. Thousands of Roman legionnaires aggressively crash over the rocky perimeter like a tidal wave of iron. The sheer kinetic impact of their massive, heavy shields violently throws the modern soldiers backward. A U.S. machine gunner desperately swings his empty M249 like a heavy baseball bat. But a Roman legionnaire has spent his entire life mastering this exact, brutal fighting distance. He brutally deflects the blow with his scutum and thrusts his steel gladius sharply upward. The 2-inch stab violently slips directly under the modern Kevlar vest, instantly puncturing a lung. The modern soldier violently collapses, drowning in his own blood, as the ancient war machine steps over him. The battlefield aggressively regresses to its most primitive, unforgiving state of nature.
It becomes a horrific, intimate contest of raw muscle, adrenaline, and absolute willingness to die. The modern soldiers fight like starving wolves, aggressively drawing their heavy combat knives and entrenching tools. A U.S. squad leader brutally buries his steel blade deep into a charging centurion's neck. But the brutal mathematics of raw numerical mass cannot be defeated by courage alone. For every Roman that violently drops dead, 5 more heavily armored legionnaires step over his bleeding corpse. The physical exhaustion is heavily setting into the modern troops' burning muscles and lungs. Swinging a rifle and fighting raw terror aggressively drains human stamina in a matter of minutes. The Roman numbers violently smother the tiny American perimeter like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The U.S. platoon leader violently empties his final 3 pistol rounds into a charging Roman's face. Before he can reload, a heavy wooden shield brutally bashes his skull, shattering his tactical helmet. He violently hits the dirt, completely defenseless against the descending iron blades. The modern circle of defense aggressively shrinks from 30 men to 15 to a desperate 5. They are completely drowning in a terrifying ocean of red shields, screaming mud, and flashing iron. The modern gods of war have been violently dragged down to the bloody earth. The final 5 American survivors form a tight, desperate circle of bloody Kevlar and jagged steel. They aggressively swing entrenching tools and combat knives, fighting with the feral intensity of cornered predators. But the Roman infantry does not fight with wild emotion. They execute with cold, mechanical precision. A heavy scutum brutally pins a screaming modern soldier to the rocky ground. A short steel gladius violently slips between the gaps of his ceramic plates, ending his resistance instantly. Within 60 terrifying seconds, the final pocket of modern defiance is violently extinguished. The deafening, mechanical roar that dominated the valley for hours is aggressively replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The surviving Roman legionnaires stand over the shattered bodies of the United States infantry platoon. They aggressively breathe the thick, burning cordite smoke, their ancient minds completely traumatized by the horrific violence. They have violently claimed the rocky hill, but this is not a triumphant, glorious ancient victory. The Roman commanders look down into the blood-soaked valley, and their blood runs entirely cold. The treacherous terrain is completely carpeted with the pulverized remains of over 2,000 veteran legionnaires. Entire elite cohorts were violently vaporized by automatic weapons fire in a matter of terrifying minutes. The modern firearms did not just kill their brothers. They aggressively shattered the psychological myth of the Roman shield. The surviving centurions carefully pick up the empty, muddy M4 carbines in absolute, stunned disbelief. They are staring at strange black metal and composite plastics, unable to comprehend the apocalyptic power they once held. The United States military did not lose this simulation because their technology was weak or flawed. They lost
because pop culture completely, fundamentally misunderstands the reality of the modern infantryman. A modern soldier is not a standalone superhero. He is the extreme, violent tip of a massive logistical spear. His terrifying lethality is completely dependent on a massive, invisible supply chain of ammunition, air support, and intelligence. Sever that critical supply chain, and his advanced weapon violently devolves into a poorly balanced club. The Roman Empire, however, built an entire military apparatus around absolute human endurance and self-sufficiency. They marched carrying their own heavy rations, their own camp defenses, and their own unbreakable morale. They were aggressively conditioned to absorb catastrophic, apocalyptic losses and simply keep marching forward. Because the ancient commanders understood the brutal, undeniable mathematics of warfare. If you are entirely willing to sacrifice thousands of men to close the fatal distance, the enemy will eventually run dry. And once that critical distance violently drops to zero, technology ceases to matter. The battlefield forcefully resets to the primal, terrifying mechanics of muscle, iron, and leverage. The Roman scutum and gladius were engineered for exactly this horrific, intimate distance of slaughter. The modern assault rifle was explicitly designed to keep the enemy hundreds of yards away. The moment the Romans aggressively crossed that invisible line, the tactical advantage violently shifted to antiquity. This brutal simulation proves that absolute technological supremacy cannot survive terrible logistical constraints. 40 men simply cannot carry enough physical lead to kill 5,000 fiercely determined human beings. The human body can only carry so many heavy magazines before physical exhaustion completely destroys mobility. And when the magazines violently run empty, the ancient gods of war return to feast on the blood. But the sheer apocalyptic cost of this Roman victory makes it completely irrelevant in the grand scheme of warfare. To kill exactly 40 modern soldiers, they sacrificed nearly half of a veteran legion. No ancient empire could ever aggressively sustain those horrific, one-sided casualty rates. If the modern platoon had possessed just one single ammunition resupply drop, the Romans would have been completely exterminated. The sheer volume of automatic fire would have aggressively reduced the entire legion to bloody mud. But in a completely disconnected, isolated survival scenario, the brutal numbers game favors the ancient horde. Distance is the absolute, life-saving armor of the modern infantryman. Once that armor is stripped away, flesh and iron forcefully dictate the outcome of the battle. The battlefield is a grim, terrifying testament to the brutal evolution of war. 40 modern bodies surrounded by a literal mountain of 2,000 ancient dead. The physical distance between these two eras is measured entirely in ammunition and human blood. The wind aggressively howls through the silent valley, blowing the gray cordite smoke over the shattered shields. The modern era demands an industrial scale of violence that the ancient mind cannot fathom. And the ancient era demands a tolerance for intimate, face-to-face slaughter we have long forgotten. The Roman army is officially combat ineffective, broken permanently by the invisible thunder. But they technically hold the bloody ground, claiming the ultimate Pyrrhic victory over the gods of technology. So, what is your final, unfiltered, tactical verdict on this horrific clash of empires? Could any ancient army ever hope to truly defeat a modern military unit under different, unpredictable conditions?
What if the United States soldiers were heavily entrenched in an urban environment instead of a rocky hill? Or what if the Romans aggressively attacked during a blinding, torrential midnight thunderstorm?
We want to hear your brutal, analytical breakdowns in the comments below. Debate the tactical possibilities and aggressively vote on who truly won this impossible simulation. If you crave more hyper-realistic military breakdowns and brutal what-if scenarios, make sure to aggressively hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. We spend countless hours meticulously breaking down the grim mathematical realities of these impossible battles. Support the channel by dropping a heavy like and sharing this absolute bloodbath with a fellow military history fanatic. The evolution of violence never stops, and neither do our brutal battlefield simulations. Until the next drop zone opens, keep your powder completely dry and your bayonets permanently fixed. Always remember that logistics dictate the absolute rules of modern combat. This is Clash of Eras Warfare, officially signing off from the blood-soaked valley. Keep your shields locked, but never trust them to stop supersonic lead. But what happens if we completely change the environmental variables of this execution? What if the United States platoon is not trapped on an exposed, rocky European hill? We forcefully reset the simulation and drop the modern soldiers directly into a dense, abandoned urban environment. The setting is a labyrinth of narrow cobblestone streets and tight, suffocating alleyways. And to make the scenario even more terrifying, we completely plunge the battlefield into pitch-black midnight. The Roman legion relies heavily on visual command signals, standard bearers, and sunlight reflecting off polished armor. In absolute darkness, their flawless, highly engineered military machine aggressively devolves into blind chaos. The modern U.S. infantry, however, absolutely owns the night. The platoon flips down their advanced panoramic night vision goggles and thermal imaging optics. The pitch-black urban ruins instantly illuminate in a crisp, terrifying spectrum of green and white-hot thermal signatures. The Romans are completely blind, aggressively stumbling through the dark alleys with their heavy shields raised. They are desperately trying to maintain formation in an environment specifically designed to break it. The modern soldiers take elevated positions inside the ruined stone buildings, creating fatal, overlapping fields of fire. A Roman cohort blindly marches down a narrow main street, their iron boots echoing loudly against the cobblestone. They are completely unaware that they are glowing like massive thermal beacons to the predators above. The modern platoon leader coldly whispers the order over the encrypted tactical radio. A suppressed M4 carbine violently coughs in the darkness, completely masking the muzzle flash.
A Roman centurion violently collapses, his neck instantly snapped by the invisible, silent kinetic strike. Panic aggressively ripples through the ancient ranks, as more men simply drop dead without a single sound. The legionnaires frantically raise their shields, but they have absolutely no idea where the lethal geometry is coming from. The US soldiers aggressively exploit the verticality of the urban environment, firing down at steep, undefendable angles. The legendary testudo formation is violently rendered completely useless by thermal snipers firing from 4-story windows. But the sheer numbers of the ancient horde aggressively force them to flood into every single alleyway. A massive group of Romans violently kicks down the wooden doors of the buildings, desperately seeking close-quarters combat. This aggressively transitions the battle into the absolute nightmare of modern CQB, close-quarters battle. The ancient warriors aggressively charge up the narrow stone stairwells, their heavy swords drawn for intimate slaughter. But a narrow stairwell is an absolute, fatal choke point against modern fragmentation explosives. A modern soldier aggressively pulls the pin on an M67 grenade and drops it down the dark stairwell. The heavy steel sphere violently bounces off the stone walls and lands directly onto the Roman shields. The enclosed stone architecture aggressively traps the explosive overpressure, amplifying the lethal shockwave. The violent detonation instantly liquidates the entire ancient assault team, violently painting the walls in hot blood. The Roman commanders desperately order their archers to fire blindly into the dark windows. But shooting heavy arrows straight up into pitch-black ruins is a completely mathematically useless tactic. The modern soldiers aggressively rotate their firing positions, ghosting through the connected rooftops like lethal shadows. In this specific urban environment, the logistical nightmare of finite ammunition is drastically reduced. The tight choke points guarantee that a single 5.56 round will violently overpenetrate multiple ancient bodies. The machine gunners do not need to lay down massive suppressive fire. They simply lock down a single, narrow street. A Roman heavy infantry push is violently shredded in a matter of seconds by a completely invisible M249. The psychological horror of fighting a completely invisible, silent enemy violently breaks the Roman discipline. For the first time in their legendary history, the veteran legionnaires violently drop their heavy shields and run. They aggressively route through the dark streets, completely abandoning their sacred formations in pure, unadulterated terror. The urban night environment aggressively strips the Roman army of their two greatest advantages: mass and visual intimidation. The US platoon violently hunts the fleeing stragglers using their thermal optics, turning the retreat into a systematic execution. By sunrise, the ancient ruins are completely choked with the shattered bodies of 5,000 Roman soldiers. The modern platoon aggressively secures the perimeter, having expended less than half of their total ammunition supply. They suffered absolutely zero casualties, achieving a flawless, impossible kinetic victory over the ancient empire. This alternative simulation violently proves that terrain and environmental visibility are absolute force multipliers. Drop the modern soldier into an open field with limited ammo, and the ancient horde will violently drown him in blood. But put that same soldier in an urban environment at night, and he becomes an untouchable, apocalyptic god of war. The brutal mathematics of combat shift aggressively based entirely on geometry and technological leverage. So, which of these two horrific battlefields is the most realistic outcome of this temporal clash? Do the Romans violently consume the modern lines in the open mud, or do they die screaming in the dark urban ruins? The truth is that military history is aggressively dictated by the exact ground upon which the blood is spilled. We want to aggressively read your tactical breakdowns of both brutal scenarios in the comments below. Which environmental variable do you believe is the absolute most important factor in warfare? Make sure you violently hit that subscribe button to join the most hardcore military simulation community on the internet. We will continue to aggressively test the absolute limits of ancient muscle against modern industrial thunder. Support the channel, share this absolute bloodbath, and keep demanding the impossible what-if scenarios. Until the next temporal drop zone violently opens, keep your night vision charged and your blades sharp. This is Clash of Eras warfare, aggressively ending the simulation. Let us violently restart the simulation one final, terrifying time. We aggressively strip away the urban darkness and the rocky European hills. We drop the modern US infantry platoon into a dense, heavily fortified Roman siege network.
The Romans have had one entire week to aggressively prepare the battlefield to their absolute advantage. They have violently ripped up the earth, creating a terrifying labyrinth of deep trenches and spike-filled ditches. Massive earthen walls, heavily fortified with sharpened wooden stakes, violently block all modern lines of sight. The modern platoon is aggressively forced to navigate this deadly, enclosed ancient trench system. Their advanced optics are completely useless when the enemy is hiding behind 10 feet of packed dirt. The Roman centurions aggressively employ brutal guerrilla tactics, violently striking from hidden tunnels. A modern soldier steps on a cleverly disguised false floor and violently drops into a pit of sharpened iron stakes. The horrific screams aggressively echo through the trenches, instantly shattering the modern psychological discipline. The U.S. soldiers violently open fire, but their 5.56 rounds simply aggressively bury themselves uselessly into the thick mud walls. The Romans aggressively refuse to form up in the open, completely neutralizing the modern automatic weapons.
They violently lob heavy clay pots filled with venomous snakes and aggressive hornets directly into the modern trenches. It sounds like an ancient myth, but biological and psychological warfare was brutally perfected by the Roman Empire. The modern troops are aggressively forced to frantically fight off swarms of insects while wearing heavy tactical gear. Suddenly, the ground violently shakes as massive Roman siege engines aggressively enter the fray. Heavy scorpions and massive ballistas violently unleash telephone pole-sized iron bolts from behind the massive earthworks. A heavy bolt brutally punches straight through a modern concrete barrier, instantly impaling 2 U.S. soldiers. The sheer kinetic force of ancient artillery violently rivals the destructive power of modern heavy weapons. The modern platoon leader frantically screams for his men to violently push forward and take the ancient artillery positions, but the deep trenches forcefully funnel the modern soldiers directly into brutal, pre-planned kill zones. As the U.S. troops aggressively surge into a wide clearing, the Romans violently spring the ultimate trap. Thousands of heavy iron javelins rain down aggressively from the high earthen walls, completely trapping the modern force. The modern soldiers violently empty their magazines, desperately trying to suppress the heavily entrenched ancient archers. But the Romans simply duck behind the thick dirt, aggressively letting the modern ammunition violently waste itself against the earth. When the deafening mechanical thunder violently sputters and dies, the final execution aggressively begins. Hidden wooden gates violently swing open, unleashing heavily armored Roman gladiators and war dogs. The massive, starving war dogs aggressively charge, violently locking their jaws onto modern Kevlar and exposed flesh. The U.S. soldiers are violently dragged to the mud, aggressively fighting off animals while the Roman infantry closes in. The brutal, intimate slaughter of the trenches violently overwhelms the modern technological advantage. A rifle is absolutely useless when you are violently pinned to the earth by 100-pound mastiff and ancient iron. The Roman engineering has aggressively and completely neutralized every single modern tactical advantage. They turned the battlefield into a suffocating, muddy trap where distance and optics violently cease to exist. The modern platoon is brutally and systematically exterminated in the cold, wet dirt of the ancient trenches. This final, horrific simulation aggressively proves that combat engineering is the ultimate equalizer in warfare. The Roman Empire conquered the known world because they violently bent the very earth to their absolute will. If an ancient army can aggressively dictate the terrain and force a close-quarters engagement, modern technology violently fails. Warfare is not just a mathematical comparison of bullet velocity versus iron thickness. It is an aggressively complex game of logistics, psychology, and environmental dominance.
The United States military is the absolute apex predator of the open, modern battlefield. But drop them into a completely disconnected, heavily trapped ancient meat grinder, and they will violently bleed like any other mortal. The Roman legion aggressively retains its title as the most terrifying, adaptable war machine in human history. They aggressively absorbed the modern thunder, violently adapted their tactics, and brutally drowned the future in mud and iron. The simulated trenches are completely silent, aggressively choked with the shattered bodies of both eras. The absolute supremacy of the modern rifle was violently challenged and brutally defeated by a shovel and a sword. As we violently close this massive three-part temporal simulation, the true brutal lesson of military history emerges. Never aggressively underestimate the terrifying ingenuity and absolute ruthlessness of the ancient human mind. They did not have the explosive chemistry of gunpowder, but they absolutely mastered the brutal geometry of death. What is your aggressively unfiltered opinion on this final, trench-based slaughter? Could modern infantry violently overcome Roman siege engineering without heavy air support or armored vehicles? Or does the brutal reality of the ancient trenches aggressively guarantee a modern defeat? We aggressively demand your tactical insights and brutal debates in the comments section right now. Your aggressively detailed analysis fuels our next impossible battlefield simulation. Which historical empire should violently clash against modern American firepower next? Should we violently drop a U.S. Marine squad into the heavy jungles against Aztec Jaguar warriors? Or test a modern sniper team against the terrifying sweeping mobility of Genghis Khan's Mongol horde? The temporal battlefield is aggressively waiting for your absolute commands. Keep your optics aggressively zeroed, your magazines heavy, and your entrenching tools violently sharp. The absolute brutal reality of human conflict never truly changes. It only changes its weapons. We have violently dragged the modern infantrymen through three entirely different circles of hell. From the open rocky valleys to the pitch-black urban ruins, and finally into the muddy ancient trenches. The results violently fluctuate between an effortless modern execution and a terrifying ancient massacre. The ultimate, undeniable conclusion is that warfare cannot be aggressively simplified into a spreadsheet of weapons stats. The environment violently dictates the absolute value of both the modern rifle and the ancient sword. Logistics, terrain, and pure psychological endurance are the true, unforgiving gods of the battlefield. The Roman Empire did not violently rule the world by simply having the thickest shields. They ruled it by aggressively out-engineering, out-enduring, and brutally out-adapting every enemy they faced.
The United States military does not violently dominate the modern globe simply by pulling triggers. It dominates through an absolutely terrifying, invisible logistical web that stretches across the entire planet. Sever that web, and the modern Titan violently crashes back down to the bloody earth. We aggressively thank you for surviving this massive three-part temporal bloodbath. The Clash of Eras warfare community is rapidly becoming the most hardcore, tactically aggressive channel on YouTube. If you have not yet violently smashed that subscribe button, you are absolutely missing the greatest battles in history. Aggressively hit the like button to feed the algorithm and violently push this simulation to the front lines. Share this brutal breakdown with every military history fanatic, active duty soldier, and tactical gamer you know. We want to violently flood the comments section with aggressive, highly detailed tactical debates. Tell us exactly where our simulation succeeded, and aggressively point out where our math violently failed. We read every single aggressive breakdown,
and your tactical insights directly shape our future simulations. The next impossible clash of eras is already being violently rendered in our tactical war room. We are aggressively loading the ballistic data, running the casualty math, and preparing the temporal drop zone. Until that massive alarm violently sounds, keep your tactical situational awareness at an absolute maximum. Keep your physical endurance high, because when the bullets violently run dry, the sword always returns. Aggressively study the brutal lessons of the past, so you are never violently surprised by the future. The blood-soaked mud of history is the greatest, most unforgiving tactical instructor in the world. Thank you for aggressively marching with us into the dark, terrifying heart of human conflict. Remember, distance is your armor, logistics are your lifeblood, and the earth is your ultimate enemy. This is Clash of Eras warfare. The simulation is aggressively and permanently offline. Dismissed.